He is the author of Elgin Baylor, The Man Who Changed Basketball, and he is the producer-writer of the docuseries Six Degrees of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. We now welcome Bijan Bayne onto Hoopsology. How's it going?
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me.
We're doing well, thank you. Thanks for appearing on the show, and thanks for just chatting with us about the legacy of Elgin Baylor. He passed on March 22nd of this year, of about the age 86, of natural causes. And just to run down his legacy, because I think a lot of young players may not know who he is, unfortunately. He was an 11-time NBA All-Star, named to the All-NBA team. I remember seeing that ceremony as a kid. I think was that during the NBA Finals, I think? Just naming him all the NBA players. Just an incredible ceremony, and of course, he is a Hall of Famer. So, Bijan, just in general, can you just give us a synopsis quickly of just what Elgin Baylor meant to just not only the NBA but just the game of basketball as a whole? Because he has a massive influence, and I feel like it doesn't get his fair due among just hoops fans worldwide.
Okay, well, I would say that Elgin Baylor is largely responsible for the geographical map of pro basketball in the U.S. because he's the reason why it moved to Southern California. He's largely responsible for the style of play that we take for granted today because he's the person that a lot of people first saw in the mainstream change hands in midair, use hesitation dribbles, use a lot of stutter steps, and a lot of the improvisation that we associate more with the schoolyard. And he's also important because of his stance on labor issues and the conditions and benefits that the players receive because of he was so vocal about segregation. He's the first player in a major team sport to sit out a game because of segregation. And he also is the only GM to sue his owner because of racial discrimination or age discrimination. And in between those two things, he was part of the threatened player boycott of the '64 All-Star game, which led to the player conditions and salaries that we see today.
And Bijan, can you please just go over, I guess, what can today's players learn from his legacy? Because you just mentioned he had a huge influence in speaking out on social issues and also labor issues as well that we see now as normal in this player empowerment era of the NBA. So, in terms of LeBron and Chris Paul and other kind of vocal leaders that they speak up if there's any kind of issue that the front office or Adam Silver that they may have with them, can you kind of speak to maybe what lessons they can learn from Elgin Baylor to maybe kind of get their point across more, be more effective in what they're trying to present?
Well, of course, it's always about leverage, and it's always about understanding who needs who more than whom, and who the fans come to see. So, of course, in the instance of the game that he sat out in Charleston, West Virginia, when he was a rookie, a lot of the fans actually came to see Hot Rod Hundley, although Elgin was very widely known. He was an All-American the season before. He was the first overall player taken in the draft. But Hot Rod Hundley was a hometown hero because he had played for UWV. So that's why the game was even being played in Charleston in the first place. But Elgin understood his leverage and didn't want to play because he had been denied lodging earlier that evening and also been denied dining. And he understood his leverage in the '64 All-Star game when his owner was one of the ones standing outside the West locker room saying, if any of my guys are in there, in other words, threatening to boycott, then they're through. And he let it be known loudly with an expletive that he wasn't coming outside and that his owner could go do a certain thing to himself. And I think it's just for the Chris Pauls and LeBron Jameses or whomever to understand that where the balance of power is, and it's probably even more in their favor than it was in 1964, certainly than it was in 1959, and understanding the moment, and also understanding that Baylor was a person who went through some things similar to what they may be faced with today. So I'm just going to use an example off the top of my head. If you felt like you were broadsided or that you were that it came out of left field that you were expected to go to Atlanta to the All-Star game because you were under the understanding before the season that there wouldn't be one because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Elgin played a year where he could only play on leave because he had been called up to the U.S. reserves during the Berlin crisis. So he's gone through some similar circumstances in terms of limited play, limited access, only being able to play here and there. So I think if you look at his example, you can find little inspirations and bits and pieces as to how to deal with, say, playing before limited crowds or no audiences, or the owners implying that they were going to do one thing and then doing another. The reason, and this is brief, the reason why there was a threatened walkout at the '64 All-Star Game in Boston is that the owners had given players the impression before the season started that they were going to implement a pension and better playing conditions and trainers on the road.
Bijan, so Elgin Baylor gets drafted in 58. His rookie season is 58-59 season, and leaves the sport in 72, which, I mean, just in American history, so many huge things obviously happened in that time frame. Can you highlight like how the NBA looked in 58 versus 72? Just kind of highlight those impacts that he made.
By all means. In 1958 to 1963, Baylor's first 5 full years, the players, when they were on the road, still washed out their uniforms in the sink of the hotel rooms while they were on the road and then put them back into their athletic bags. Most of the teams didn't have a doctor that traveled with them, and most didn't have a trainer that traveled with them. So if you were seriously hurt on the road, the other team's trainer attended to you if they had a full-time trainer. A lot of the travel on the Eastern Seaboard was by train. There weren't direct airline connections to some of the cities in the league when Elgin played, or certainly between certain cities. So when he enters the league in '59, Minneapolis and Fort Wayne are still in the league. So are Syracuse and Rochester. So a lot of times there would have to be a connecting train or connecting car or things of that nature, because there wasn't the same infrastructure between the cities that they played. So they were tired. Even going into the '64 All-Star Game, to revert back to that, when the players were traveling from their respective cities to Boston, there was a snowstorm starting in Boston. So a lot of guys are catching train and plane combinations, or plane then train, or trying to get into Boston North Station or Boston South Station or Boston Back Bay in the middle of a blizzard, because they weren't traveling privately or on charter. So those are some of the things. And the officiating was much different. The crowds were more unruly and were closer to the players. The media was much different. There were only 3 TV networks, and there weren't a lot of guarantees in terms of contracts, because one of the, again, this is understanding leverage, one of the pivotal things about the '64 All-Star Game is it was sort of a test case to see whether or not there was viability for the network to do a national contract.
Can you discuss Baylor's above the rim approach to the game? I feel like that doesn't get enough due. I saw even in an interview that in terms of him just being the aerial specialist, that's something that wasn't planned. He was reacting to the defense, what was given to him, and he was adapting to it. So can you just kind of go into detail in terms of Baylor laying the foundation for the other aerial greats that we would see later on? He was pretty much the bedrock of what we see on like a daily basis in the NBA.
That's a very good question. He's sort of the John Glenn of that, or if you wanted to use a musical analogy, the Charlie Parker. So basically, he's never cited an influence, and he's never cited, oh, I saw this person in the schoolyard in DC. I took a little bit of this person, a little bit of that person. He's always said, which makes a lot of sense because running backs say this as well, I was just reacting to what the defense did. So if I switched hands, or if I spun, or if I hesitated the dribble, or if I stutter stepped, or if I did other adjustments, even if they were in midair, they were just in response to what the defense dictated, or a double team coming, or a switch. It's not so much that he thought of himself as, oh, I'm going to become this stylistic innovator and take the game to a new level. I'm going to be the first person to knife through 2 defenders and come out and do a reverse on the other side of the basket and bank it in. He probably wasn't the first person to do it. He might have been the first person that a lot of people saw do it on national television. And he incorporated elements that he probably learned by just woodshedding different things in the schoolyard as a reaction to what one or two defenders might do, and even obviously in regulation games. And then he had the ingenuity and the body control and the reflexes to actually incorporate those things into his games, whereas others may have not. And he also had very large hands. So he can incorporate some of these switches and moves and palms into his game because of the strength of his hands and wrists. And that is sort of a guidepost or a model for people that also have large, strong hands that are watching games in the mid 60s on TV, like Julius Erving and Connie Hawkins.
And Bijan, can you kind of go into detail regarding Baylor being one of the first to use the Euro step as well? I wasn't aware of this until his passing, and that's something, it's called the Euro step, but yet he was the first one to create it. And I guess this goes into even his aerial aspect of his game. He doesn't get his fair due at all. I feel like he's just massively disrespected in just not only the NBA history, but basketball history overall globally. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's a good observation. I mean, he retired at the beginning of the 71-72 season, so basketball is still third in terms of popularity in the national culture to Major League Baseball and pro football. By that time, it was probably pro football. Then MLB is a little behind because of the things that happened in '68 with the year of the pitcher and people saying the scores were too low and the game was a little slow. And then basketball. Now basketball is coming fast because there's two pro men's leagues by then, and there's sort of a rivalry budding, so to speak. And there's player wars and draft wars and signing wars, and some people are defecting to the ABA, which causes another labor issue that's important. But the thing about him not getting some of the love that he might have gotten had he played later is that he played before the Magic Bird era. He played before there was an ESPN. He really had his peak years before his two successive injuries on different knees before 65. So before 65, he's somewhat overshadowed by Russell. He's somewhat overshadowed by Chamberlain because they're giants and they had a rivalry with each other. And he's somewhat overshadowed by Oscar because they're both 6'5" and they're both great passer, rebounder, scorer, great all-around players, and they're the same. They don't play the same position, but they're the same height. So they're sort of the best two players who aren't Chamberlain and Russell. And because Chamberlain and Russell had this war, especially when one was in Boston and one was in Philly, they played each other often, and you could air those games on national TV as sort of a battle of the Titans. Baylor sort of falls underneath as sort of the fourth or fifth guy. He might have been maybe like the Henry Aaron or the Roberto Clemente, even though he's in a big media market. So he was well known, but then we're 50 years removed from his retirement.
Bijan, I'm wondering, you kind of answered a question that I had for you in terms of his relative popularity. So kind of to expand on that for, the average person in that time, like 65 and before, 1965 and before, was Baylor a household name of an athlete? How popular was he to kind of the casual sports fan in his time and in his prime?
Well, in his peak, he was a household name. He was a little bit before this person, but I'll give you an analogy. He was the Gale Sayers of basketball. He was considered the most exciting, or some people might say most electrifying, or most thrilling person in this sport. If you want to use an example that predates Baylor, he was the Willie Mays. So he was the person that had all the thrilling moves that you wanted to go out and emulate on the playground later that day. Not Russell, not Chamberlain. They're giants and they're titans and they're Goliaths, and that's a different game played, largely under the rim. Although Chamberlain, when he came in the league, of course, had the ball handling ability and the passing and the fadeaway J early on. So Baylor is the one that the kids are fascinated with because he's aerial. Children are always fascinated with something aerial, like Jordan or emulating Doc. That's a big. I'm not sure why this is, but that elevated game is a big thing with children. I wouldn't call him a high flyer in the Dominique Wilkins, Benny Anders family, Darrell Griffith family. I call him more of a floater and a hanger, sort of in the Billy Cunningham family. So that made him a household name. Plus, he's in Los Angeles after 1960, so he's in a big media capital, and he's in the finals almost every year. So everybody in America, even if they didn't follow the sport closely, knew who he was. because he was on their children's lips. He was on the cover of sports magazines when they would go into the grocery store or into the pharmacy, and he was considered sort of the Gale Sayers of his sport, or the Barry Sanders of his sport. He had the most thrilling moves in a major team sport.
You mentioned his multiple NBA Finals appearances. Did not winning the championship haunt him? And also, we see now with Charles Barkley, he gets ridiculed because he didn't win a title in his career. Was the public scrutiny tough on him for not accomplishing that goal, or they just appreciated his skill up on the basketball court?
No, not at the time, because there was more pressure on Wilt because of that. Because Wilt was a center, and Wilt faced Russell in some Eastern finals and even some NBA finals. So there was more pressure on Wilt because of that than there was on Elgin, because Elgin was a forward, and Elgin also had Jerry. So after 61 and 62, it was sort of like Elgin and Jerry haven't beaten Russell yet. Whereas Wilt was like, Wilt hasn't beaten Russell yet, because Wilt and Russell play the same position. So it wasn't like Karl Malone or Stockton or Clyde or Barkley or Ewing, because everyone, the sports writers and the fans always looked at Wilt as the person who hadn't won the big one yet and gotten over the hump until 67, when the Sixers famously not only got over the hump, but they eliminated the Celtics in the Eastern Finals. And they really, that year, I think they started like 35-5, and they ended up 68-13. And so Wilt still has this sort of loser label with a lot of people, especially people who weren't around then. But Wilt was on a 69-13 team one year, and he was on a 68-13 team another year. But yeah, Elgin didn't face that much scrutiny in real time, although he and West did face some. But it wasn't like fair for a lot of feature articles or op-eds or hot takes in the press. I think in terms of how he felt about it, he and Jerry always had a lot of regret, because they made so many finals and some of them went to 6 and 7 games against Boston. So it wasn't like they were getting swept.
Bijan, can you talk about Elgin's contribution to the game after he retires in the start of that 71-72 season? Where does he go from there? We know he ends up winning executive of the year, eventually. Where did he go, and what is kind of his trajectory after retiring?
So after retiring, Elgin was sometimes rumored to be the leading candidate for coaching jobs, even though he really didn't have formal coaching experience. He had some summer coaching experience and some pro-am coaching experience. And then in 74, he took over the New Orleans Jazz head coaching position. And he coached Maravich there, and he coached some relatively mediocre teams there, but the team wasn't that hadn't been in existence that long. They played in the Superdome. They weren't super successful, and then he resurfaces in the front office under Donald Sterling. So on his Clippers, and he did other things. He promoted concerts. He did some minor TV cameos and things of that nature. He worked behind the scenes for some bottling companies and things like that. So he had a lot of interest. He did some property developing in Northern Virginia near D.C. But concert promotion was one of his big asides or one of his sidelight interests. In terms of basketball with the Clippers, he tried to sign a lot of people that he didn't have the support of Sterling to sign when they were rookies or free agents, because Sterling wasn't that liberal with his bankroll. And that word got around to agents and potential draftees. The players that were signed with the Clippers that were strong trade acquisitions, like Doc Rivers or Ron Harper, would often get hurt after they came to the Clippers. And some of the people that they were able to draft early enough when they had decent drafts, or were fortunate and didn't have a draft where Baylor was saddled with having made a poor selection, some of the picks that were considered consensus picks or strong picks, like Danny Manning, also got hurt.
Bijan, I want to ask you, how does Elgin Baylor fit into Laker pantheon of players. I mean, the Lakers are one of those teams that they have such a rich history and such a deep roster of just legends and Hall of Famers. In terms of ranking him in that kind of lineup of just legends, where do you think he kind of falls? Where do you have him ranked in terms of like the greatest Laker? Where does he fit in your opinion?
Well, it's difficult now because there've been so many. Because when Bob Short moved the team to Los Angeles to showcase him, you wouldn't have been able to attract the players that we're going to put on that list to that market if the team doesn't move there because of Elgin. So you're not getting a Shaquille. Worthy you might draft. It depends. I mean, Worthy and Dominique were the two people that they were considering. Magic, of course, was in the draft. You're not going to get Kobe was in the draft, but you might not get some of the other people that we might be considering. And so when you look at the people that came there when they were already playing ball, like Kareem, I don't think Kareem goes to a Minneapolis because he wanted to leave Milwaukee. So in saying that, when you formulate this list of where does he fit with Irvin and Kareem, for whom that was his second team, and Kobe, who came there when he was a teenager, and Shaq, and his own teammate Jerry West, with whom he overlaps, except for the first two seasons when West wasn't there. It's a little tricky because he's the reason why they're in an attractive media market in the first place. I would say because he's the one that built it, I think he's above them in the pantheon in a certain way because he created Showtime. He's the reason why Doris Day and James Garner and Bing Crosby and Danny Thomas start going to the games. So now that he's set the table, it becomes an attractive market. Wilt didn't go there until he was already an established player. So Wilt is also in that conversation as well. Although when Wilt goes there, he's focusing more on defense and rebounding than he was earlier in his career. But I would say if you're going to look at people who, from beginning to end, it's going to be some type of conversation between Irvin and Kobe.
And Bijan, I just want to also ask you, nowadays, I feel like even though we have technology and YouTube and plenty of books and literature to kind of trace the history of the game, I feel like in terms of just watching the NBA on a nightly basis, the history of the game is not being really presented in terms of kind of the younger players knowing, certain eras of the history of the league. And I feel even when we get into a point like, 40, 50 years from now, legends like Elgin Baylor is going to be lost in time. What is the responsibility of not only the NBA, but the television partners to make sure that the viewers at home know the legacy, of the NBA? Because, as the years go by, we will see more great players and the athletes that built, the game of basketball. My fear is that they might get lost compared to what's hot and new and nowadays.
Well, it's difficult to say because we have so much footage and we have so much media now, and I don't know what the shape of media and digital media is going to be in 2030 or 2040, sure, especially socially, because there wouldn't have been that much footage of him in the 80s because there was no YouTube, or the early 90s because there was no YouTube. So I will compare it to people that this phenomena has already beset. Your name is always going to be pushed down because of recency. So the priority of how you're mentioned in the culture is always going to be sort of brushed to the side when there's more and more athletes that have succeeded you. In his case, we're talking about almost 50 years since his retirement. Really 50 because it was technically 71. It was the beginning of the 71-72 season. And so he's going to suffer from that, but so is Jordan, because Jordan suffers from people that have only seen LeBron. Because Jordan, we're looking at 20 years out now, or almost 20, maybe 18. So it's not just him, but I think it's different for him because you would have to be in your early 60s to have even seen him on his downslope. You would have to be in mid 60s and above in age to have seen him anywhere near his peak. So there's a lot of video, there's a lot of viral things available on him. I think when people watch it, there's no context because a lot of things that he did are taken for granted today. So it doesn't look as revolutionary as it might look when it was happening in real time. So I will say this. I say people that we now think are dominant in the culture and certainly household names are going to get pushed down 30 years from now because people will say, well, that person was trash or that person didn't play against anybody. So I remember thinking when Jordan was still in the latter part of his Bulls career before he even went to Washington, that 25 years from now, kids are not going to be celebrating him because their dad and mother and aunt saw him. They're going to be saying that person was trash and the league wasn't anything because they said it of Oscar. And Oscar was Jordan. Oscar could pass, he could rebound, he could shoot, he could drive. And he was 6'5". So people say, oh, yeah, the guy was, he played against these guys that are just standing around and they can't guard and their feet look like they're glued to the floor and nobody's moving. So, and Wilt gets it a lot too. He's tall and he's supposed to average 50. Well, Chuck never didn't average 50 and he's tall. Manute didn't average 50 and he's tall. Swin Nader and Tom Burleson didn't average 50 and they're tall. So it's actually an anomaly that he's graceful and coordinated and tall. But people take it as, oh, yeah, if I was that tall and the other guys were all 6'3", I could average 50. Well, the other guys weren't all 6'3". But no, he will suffer because he's already suffered because your name just gets pushed down.
Yeah, spot on there. I wanted to ask you, do we have a good sense, so much with basketball just in general has changed since he retired, the adaptation of the three-point line. We've heard, you brought up Oscar Robertson. He certainly had some comments about Steph Curry, in the past few years where he didn't really like the direction of where modern basketball was going, things like that. We've heard that from a lot of former players. So I don't mean to put Oscar on blast or anything, but
No.
I'm just wondering if we have a sense, or if you have a sense of what Elgin Baylor thought in terms of the evolution of the game of basketball in general. Did he like where things were going? He was involved in some of the modern era of basketball, pre-Warriors era, but still things were adapting in that direction. What were his thoughts about modern basketball?
Well, I think he would have liked a lot of the evolution of sort of the creation of space because he liked to operate from the left side driving right on sort of a drive across the top of the key to his strong hand. And one of the conflicts when the Lakers did acquire Wilt was Bill Van Bredekoff was the coach, and he was coming from Princeton. And Wilt occupied the part of the lane that Elgin likes to operate in. So that was a little bit of a rub for a while. In terms of the spacing, in terms of the stretch game, in terms of the three, which of course did exist during his time, but it was in the ABA. I think from what I've read of his quotes that he liked evolution because he liked up-tempo, he liked to run, he had Maravich, he understood the fact that it was an entertainment industry and that people came to see flair and scoring. He was the reason why it moved to Los Angeles, so he got that. And I think anything that made the game more entertaining, within reason, he would have liked and understood. And I think he would have really, I don't see him as a person that would have been a hater as far as stretching the floor and creating space because of that dribble drive that he really liked to employ. I don't know what he would have thought about the extremes of it from a purist or a coaching standpoint. And I don't know that he would have been a huge fan of people stopping on a 3-on-1 or a 2-on-1 and literally stopping at the line and taking a shot.
Yeah.
Because I look at him as a finisher, and I also look at him as a facilitator that sometimes ran the break for the Lakers with him having two wings on either side of himself. So I think just because generationally it would have looked negative to him for somebody to come down and just pull from the line without waiting for his teammates to join him and having a 3-on-1 or taking advantage of the power play. I don't think he would have liked that, but I don't think anybody from his generation is really in love with that.
I still don't know that I am, to be honest, in some cases.
It kind of depends on who the shooter is. It kind of depends on the score. I think my take on some of this is, and I'm younger, I'm obviously a generation younger than Elgin, but I'm older than Steph. In the ABA, that shot was a shot that was taken by a person that was almost the equivalent of a field goal kicker or a punter. So the person that took that shot on each team was a specialist. So on Kentucky, Louis Dampier took that shot. On Dallas, Darryl Carrier took that shot. On Indiana Pacers, Billy Keller took that shot. McGinnis didn't really take that shot. That's not his shot. He went to his higher percentage shot. So I think when you see the evolution of the game, the fact that people just take the shot is akin to somebody that's in their 70s or 80s seeing somebody just walk on and try a field goal.
Do you
in
see
football.
it? Gotcha. Do you see it perhaps getting even more crazier with the shots? I mean, the way that you see Trae Young or Steph Curry or Damian Lillard, I mean, they're taking these shots like they would like a three-pointer, 10 years ago. I mean, it's not a uncommon occurrence during the game. So do you see the floor even expanding even more? And how do you feel about that? Do you think that's going to kind of, I don't know, ruin the integrity of the game, or do you think that's just a natural evolution of things?
I don't think it's going to hurt fandom. I think it's going to hurt. I think it's viewed one way by people that just don't like that strategy and don't like that brand of basketball. And I think it's also personnel based. I think if you're doing it, and because the recent 2 or 3 years ago Houston teams actually didn't win. So I think when people thought that they were doing it in playoff series or in circumstances where they were behind and they weren't catching up, the advocate of doing it was saying that, yes, but it's worth more than a 2. So I'm catching up this much faster than I would if they made a 2. That was his case. And the case against it was, well, what if you miss? And also that the rebounds are so long. So I don't come down hard on one side of it or the other, because I think the commissioners and the general managers and the owners are going to keep something in place as long as they don't see a migrate or an exodus of fans. Just like not being able to do certain things against the defense, the offense in football anymore, not being able to do certain things to the wide receiver, not being able to hit the quarterback a certain way or right after he's released the ball. As long as it generates more offense, I don't think they're going to change those things, because they would have to be like a mass dip in viewings or downloads or streaming for them to say, now this is a turnoff. The reason baseball lowered the pitching mound is because they saw fans going away and they saw football catching up. They said, well, now we've had this pitcher with a 1.12 ERA, and we've had a guy win 31 games, and we had another guy have 13 shutouts and 9 shutouts. Tiant did this, and McClain did that, Gibson did that, and Drysdale just threw 6.5 games where he didn't allow a run consecutively. So we got to even it up a little bit, because the leading hitter in the American League only batted .301. And not just that, that's the stylistic or the taste element of it. The end result was the fans were leaving. So I think the fans would have to be leaving for people to say, let's move the line back, or let's change a rule and you can only take that shot at this times of the game, but in the last 2 minutes, we're going to do this or this or this, or we're going to give you 3.5 if you do this, or 2.5 if you do that.
Well, Bijan, thank you very much for joining the show. Really appreciate it. Please let our listeners and viewers know where they can find you on social media, and also any projects you're working on this year, along with your previous books you've written as well.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. So on social media, I can be found on Twitter, and it's at Bijan C. Bayne, at lowercase Bijan, middle initial C. Bayne. The book is, of course, available either through your local bookseller, if you like to patronize them now that things are opening back up in some places, or it can be ordered on Amazon. And I do hang out on Instagram as well. And on Instagram, it's Bijan C. Bayne. So it's Bijan C. Bayne. So thanks so much.
Thank you for joining the show. Really enjoyed the chat. It was awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, guys.